to be held. I'm held responsible for all of the COVID outbreak because I tempted fate. As Ashley Bloomfield was leaving the morning tea, he said, "Goodbye, Geoff," and I called out after him, "Bye, Ashley. I hope you never have to deal with anything as bad as the 1918 flu." So, you can blame me for tempting fate on all of that. Okay, I'm going to give you a few stories about my work on the 1918 flu, and I'll begin at the beginning. My work was sparked by a casual conversation with my father sometime in 1977. As a young parent, I was keen to find out more about our family's history, and I asked my father to name the most vivid experience of his childhood. And his answer came quickly, "Why, the Black Flu, of course." And I'd never heard of it. "When was that?" I asked. And his reply went something like this: "That was the big flu epidemic at the end of the First World War. People collapsed and died like flies, and it went through the country like wildfire. Thousands died, especially the Maoris." Now, his childhood was spent in Taumarunui, and his parents, my grandparents, were among the few who didn't get the flu, and they worked long hours looking after their neighbours. And every morning, my grandfather would go door to door to check on the sick neighbours. My father then was only about 10, but he helped in lighting the fires in the coal ranges. He also had to look into the bedrooms to see if anybody had died in the night. And I thought I'd catch him out there. I said, "Well, surely they'd just look as though they were asleep." And I will never forget the shock of his reply. "Oh, you could tell all right, because in that flu, when they died, the bodies turned black. That's why your nana called it the Black Flu." I now know why the bodies turned black, because severe pneumonia following influenza filled the lungs with blood and fluid, reducing the amount of oxygen exchanged into the bloodstream. This causes cyanosis, which turns the face and ears purple, and in the worst cases, there might have been the start of necrosis of internal organs. So the bodies not only turned black, but they had a peculiar smell. And one eyewitness told me it was a kind of sweet, rotting smell. So they had to be buried quickly. So that was how I became hooked on the 1918 flu. I've caught the bug and I haven't been able to shake it off ever since. Taumarunui was a long way off, so I thought I'd try to find out about Christchurch first. The newspapers of the day were full of news about the flu, but nowhere could I find details of death tolls in small towns like Taumarunui. And I later discovered that there had been an official ban on publishing death totals during the pandemic. This was to avoid public panic, but in fact, of course, it allowed free rein for rumour and misinformation. I found later official reports in 1919, but they were set at the national or provincial levels. And so I was wondering, how could I find out about the people who died in Taumarunui? And then it dawned on me that for every person who died there would have been a death certificate. So one day I simply wandered into the local office of the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages here in Christchurch and asked to see the death records for 1918. I remember that registrar. His name was Mr. Aitken, and he had a club foot with a big raised black boot. And he said, "I've been wondering when someone would come and take a look at the 1918 volumes." He took me in the back and we opened a big leather-bound register, and there they were, the Christchurch victims, page after page, hundreds of names. Cause of death, influenza 7 days, pneumonia 3 days. As a naive young historian, not knowing what was likely to be useful, I took copious notes of everything I found, and the index cards finally filled a shoebox. Those of you who work in population will be very familiar with that, I'm sure, but the death records were astonishingly detailed. Name, sex, age, occupation, matrimonial status, offspring by sex and age, religion, place and date of burial, name of officiating minister, etc. It's a wealth of information. But I had to invent my own methodology. There were no models in the sociological literature or in disaster studies that quite fitted a pandemic. And the article I published about Christchurch in the New Zealand Journal of History in 1979 was then copied by thesis students in Auckland and Dunedin, applying my methodology and getting results from there. So then I thought, well, that's a good start. We could probably cover the whole country and do the Maori deaths as well. But it was a very big mountain to climb. And if I'd known what I was taking on, I might have thought twice about it. It took several years of work in the holidays, visiting Lower Hutt to take notes from the death registers. And the Registrar General at the time, Jack Wright, I pay him this tribute. He'd given me free and open research access. Nowadays, of course, New Zealand's much stricter privacy laws would probably incline his successor to say no. So I was lucky to live in a more relaxed and trusting age. Oddly enough, when I got through the Taumarunui deaths, I recognised a name, Catherine Micklejohn Hercock, née Reid. That was my great-grandmother. She was one of the first white children born at Petone in 1843. And when I told my father about this, he was incredulous. She had been living with them, but he had no recollection of her death. He just assumed that she had died of old age. But there it was in the death records, like hundreds of others: influenza 7 days, pneumonia 3 days. Well, to cut a long story short, as Rosemary mentioned, my first monograph was published in 1988 with this rather ghastly cover. It was the first modern study of the pandemic anywhere in the world based on individual death records at the country level. Perhaps nobody else had been boneheaded enough to do all that tedious work in the death records. And remember, this was before the invention of laptops or the digitized newspapers of papers past, which would have made the job so much easier. The statistical analysis were done here at Canterbury with punch cards on a big mainframe IBM computer. But finally, I found a pocket calculator was the most useful thing to give me the death rates. In 2005, Canterbury University Press published an enlarged and illustrated second edition, and this book was helpful for the Ministry of Health revising its pandemic plan. The story I heard was that as good bureaucrats, they asked, well, when was the last flu pandemic? That was 1968. It lasted through to 1970. How many people died? Oh, about 300. Oh, then we won't need very many body bags. But somebody on that committee, I think it was John Boyd, had read my book and said, well, hang on, if we have another pandemic that kills at the same rate as 1918, we'd be looking at a lot more deaths. So they looked at my book and they went away and did the numbers and realized that they would need to order at least 33,000 body bags. The centenary of the 1918 pandemic in 2018 helped to remind everyone of the risk from a future pandemic. That was a very busy year. I was at conferences. I went to Singapore and Melbourne, and I gave over 30 lectures up and down the country. So some of you may have heard me on this before. I addressed a Ministry of Health conference and various planning groups in Wellington. And I also published a condensed and updated version of Black November. This was aimed at school children, high school kids, and was called Black Flu 1918, with lots of new colour pictures. So altogether, New Zealand, I think, was very well prepared for a new influenza pandemic, but then COVID arrived. And as Michael Baker famously quipped, we had a good pandemic plan for the wrong virus. But the lessons of 1918 had been absorbed by the Ministry of Health. In my speech at the unveiling of the memorial, I had said that the big lesson from 1918 is that delay is dangerous and complacency kills. And so I was very pleased that Jacinda and Ashley had got that message on board and agreed to go hard and fast with this new virus. I'm so glad to have been living in New Zealand and not in Sweden, where they were very complacent and 14,000 people have died. For a country with a comparable population, look at Ireland, which has now had 500,000 cases and 5,700 dead. New Zealand for a long time was about the lowest death rate in the OECD with just 25 deaths. We are now, thanks to Delta, we're now up to about 44. Anyway, back to 1918. The great advantage of working from individual death records rather than from predictive models based on a few limited samples was that the full patterns of diffusion and social impact could be revealed in detail. And the diffusion dates were very, very interesting. Auckland had the first severe outbreak starting in late October. And the coincidence led many people to blame the Prime Minister, Bill Massey, who had come back on the ship Niagara from Vancouver from a war conference. The ship had had a lot of flu among the stewards and one death, but no passengers had caught it. On arrival in Auckland, the doctors who went on board the ship could see no difference between those cases and many cases that were already ashore in Auckland, because Auckland was in the midst of a mild flu pandemic That was the first wave of the 1918 pandemic. So the cases from the ship were put into isolation at Auckland Hospital, and the passengers were allowed to disperse throughout the country. The health department later traced all of those people, but they couldn't find any evidence of outbreaks occurring from the passengers. But what was overlooked at the time was that there were 2 troop ships arriving in Auckland in the same week as the Niagara, and they brought back about 2,000 returning sick and wounded soldiers. And many of those soldiers had been in the camps in southern England where the second wave had started, and many of them would have been symptomless carriers, and they were allowed to go home all over the country. Now, that helps to explain why the influenza seemed to break out almost simultaneously from one end of New Zealand to the other in early November. It followed what the geographers used to call central place theory, the cities first, and then the larger towns, then the smaller towns, depending on how close they were to railway lines. It seems very obvious that the railways were the main way in which the flu was spread. The only part of the country which had a much clearer diffusion pattern was Northland, which of course was the roadless north in those days with few roads, and I'll show you that one. That was the only part of the country where the onset dates marched in a regular pattern up towards the north. I'll just go back to this one if you want to have another look at that. But the rest of the country was a jumble of arrows darting back and forth without any clear pattern. And that helped me to conclude that the severe second wave had come on the troop ships and not on the Niagara. So we can let Bill Massey off the hook. Since this is not an academic lecture, but a bit of an entertainment, I will sing you a song. One of my eyewitnesses said that she remembers as a girl in Hamilton that they adapted or put to the tune of Mademoiselle from Armentières this little ditty. Old Bill Massey brought the flu, parlez-vous. Old Bill Massey brought the flu, parlez-vous. Old Bill Massey brought the flu, it's a pity he didn't get it too. Inky, dinky, parlez-vous. So that was one of the lighter moments of the flu. But the most striking feature of the Pakeha deaths in 1918 was the preponderance of young adults. Seasonal influenza, as you all know, normally only kills the very vulnerable, the very young and the very old. Healthy adults rarely die from influenza. But in 1918, all over the world, people in their 30s and 40s died in huge numbers. Age-specific death rates among Pakeha showed peaks for those between 25 and 34. If you look at these graphs, interestingly, the rates for males in these age groups were twice those for females. But it doesn't take much cogitation to discover a reason for this. There was no unemployment benefit in 1918. So if men did not work, they did not get paid. And I think hundreds of men with the flu got up from their sick beds to get back to work in order to feed their families, and there suffered relapses, developed pneumonia, and died in large numbers. But there is another possible hypothesis about the preponderance of young adults in the 1918 pandemic. This is the work of Dennis Shanks and John Brundage. Their studies of the flu in many US and Canadian cities found the peak age of death was much the same at about 28 years. If you count back from 1918, you get back to 1890. What was happening then? Well, what was happening then was the previous influenza pandemic, the so-called Russian flu of 1889 to 93. And their hypothesis is that babies and infants exposed to that new virus had their immune systems primed for influenza and was compromised in some way, perhaps by dysregulated T cells. So that when those individuals as young adults encountered a different influenza virus in 1918, their immune systems overreacted, went crazy, and caused what is called a cytokine storm, unleashing pneumonia. And they literally drowned in their own secretions as their lungs filled with fluid and their skin turned purple, then black. Another explanation suggests that the First World War may have produced newer and deadlier strains of pneumonia, and that this was what killed people already weakened by the flu. So there are a number of hypotheses, but whatever the reasons, the 1918 pandemic killed at least 50 million people worldwide and possibly more. It remains the world's worst pandemic since the Black Death of the 14th century, and COVID has not so far come anywhere near the severity of 1918. So the individual death records enabled me to plot the onset dates and peaks of mortality for towns and cities and regions. This is a graph of the four main centres, and you'll notice immediately that the numbers decline markedly as you get further south. Dunedin had a much lower level outbreak than certainly than Auckland. Auckland had it first, of course, and there is a possibility that either the virus weakened as it went south, or more likely that the south was much better prepared because it had the example of what was happening up in Auckland. The analysis of, I did a lot of graphs which never appeared in the book, but here's the chart at the back of the book, Black November, which summarizes some of that data, charts of onset dates and peaks. I'm sorry, you probably won't be able to read that from where you are. The analysis of occupations tended to confirm what I'd suspected early on, that the flu was no respecter of class. Rich and poor alike were infected, and there were no effective cures or remedies in those days because antibiotics and vaccines still lay far ahead in the future. So the deaths reflected the broad outlines of New Zealand society at the time. On the other hand, your position in the class structure would affect how well you coped with the flu if you got it. Well-off families, middle-class and upper-class families, had more resources, had more money to get good nursing and to cope with the infection, so that the pandemic impacted much more strongly, much harder on lower income and poor people. The details about orphanism were interesting. One of the myths I'd heard about the 1918 flu was that it had wiped out whole families. This was not really so. Only 46 families lost both parents, leaving 135 orphans in the true sense. But many more families lost one parent. There were 6,400 Pākehā children and over 8,000 Maori children who lost one parent in the pandemic. And that's just from the registered deaths. These figures must conceal a great deal of grief and heartache for so many bereaved families. The loss of a breadwinner could change the life of a family very sharply. And it was this social impact of the flu on families that interested me from the start and kept me going on this project. The other big feature of the 1918 flu, of course, was the gross contrast in death rates between Maori and Pākehā. When I first published my results in 1988, the death rate for Pākehā was 5.8 per thousand, but for Maori were 42 per thousand, 7 times greater. Some of you will know of the work of Professor Ian Poole, highly respected New Zealand demographer, who had published an earlier article on Maori deaths in the 1918 pandemic, working backwards from fertility data. But my head counting had produced a rather different set of figures, and because they were based on death records much more accurate, which he generously acknowledged after we'd had a bit of an exchange in the New Zealand Population Review. I would guess that Pākehā death registration in 1918 was virtually complete. I'd say 99% or 100 even. But Maori had been required to register births, deaths and marriages only since 1915, and registration then was very incomplete. I dutifully counted the registered Maori deaths in the registers at Live-In House in Lower Hutt, but I knew from my newspaper research at that time that in some parts they looked too low. I knew that many more Maori had died in some localities. And then one of the helpful ladies in the registrar's office in Lower Hutt said to me that the Maori registrations in those days were always late. She suggested I look into the 1919 volume. And there, to my astonishment, I found another 500 deaths that had occurred in November, December 1918, but had not been registered until months later. The official figures published at the time had completely missed these extra ones. They sort of stopped counting at the end of December. My total of registered Maori deaths was 1,679, but my newspaper research had found evidence for another 481 deaths that had not been registered. Now, these were the reports from relief parties sent out to the local power. They often arrived too late to help the sick, and found rows of fresh graves instead. In some places in Northland, the flu victims were buried in pits beside the local church. So that's where the myth about mass graves originates. So by then I had evidence for 2,160 Maori deaths. And from the estimated Maori population of 51,000, that gave me the death rate of 42 per thousand. But I still had a hunch that that was still not the full picture. Northland and Waikato were the obvious problem areas. Newspaper coverage there was poor, and yet oral history spoke of scores of deaths that had been neither registered nor reported to authorities. And then, unfortunately, after the book had been published, I started to hear about Maori flu memorials. There was one in the Hokianga at Motukaraka, which has the names of 8 flu victims from a prominent Maori family. And when I checked the names against my notes, I found that only half of them had been registered. Not far away at Otiria, in the old meeting house that was used as an emergency flu hospital in 1918, there is a framed list of the names of 28 people who died there. And again, only half had been registered. And the year before last, my wife and I were able to visit in Hawke's Bay, the memorial at Te Reinga, inland from Wairoa. This is a very splendid monument in Maori. But of the 40 names on this monument, only 9 had been registered, and none have been reported in the local Wairoa newspaper. So my hunch that the Maori total was still too low seemed to be confirmed. So when I wrote the updated version of Black November for 2018, Black Flu 1918, I made a new estimate of Maori mortality to give it a round figure of 2,500. And that gave a much higher death rate of 49 per thousand, very nearly 5%. Now that's one of the highest death rates in the world for the 1918 pandemic, though of course not nearly as bad as Western Samoa, where 20% of the population perished thanks to the negligence of the New Zealand military authorities there. So the Maori death rate in the 1918 flu, from my numbers, now stands at 8 times that of Pakeha. I gave a paper on Maori mortality in the 1918 pandemic at a conference in Madrid in 2017, but the planned volume of conference papers never got published. So I was very pleased when last year the New Zealand Journal of History published my article explaining why Maori died at this much greater rate than Pakeha. So when you add the 2,500 estimate of Maori to the more robust Pakeha figures, that gave us a total of just on 9,000, which I think is probably still a little bit on the cautious side. But have a think about that. 9,000 is half the number of New Zealand casualties in the whole of the First World War. And it took 4 years to kill 18,000 soldiers. But we lost 9,000, mostly civilians, in just 6 weeks at the end of 1918. Now, New Zealand has hundreds of war memorials, nearly 900, I believe, but very, very few reminders of the 1918 pandemic, which is why it gave me very great satisfaction to help unveil the National Memorial in November 2019. Some localities have been very active. This is the splendid monument erected in New Plymouth in remembrance of those who died in the 1918 pandemic. And you'll notice that they've extended the date a bit to 1919, recognizing that there were a handful who survived, held out until early January 1919, but the great bulk of New Zealand victims died in 1918. You may wonder what happened to my notes about the Maori registered deaths. My dear wife Edwina, who helps me in so many ways, helped me to prepare an Excel spreadsheet of my notes from the Maori registered deaths, and we handed that back to the Registrar General in 2018, and his staff renamed it. They gave it a new name, Namanu Haumumu, the silenced birds. And I think that's a wonderfully evocative and sad name, and that is now available to all Runanga who want it. But sadly, the names of over 800 further Maori victims remain unknown, except remembered by their descendants. Now, Christchurch has this splendid memorial to the victims of the 2011 earthquakes. It's a long marble wall beside the Avon River, and it cost the taxpayer, you and me, $11 million. And yet Christchurch lost 462 citizens in the 1918 flu, and they had no memorial until just last year. And I'm pleased to report that members of the Canterbury History Foundation very kindly helped me raise enough funds for this modest plaque on a seat near the hospital, giving the numbers and a reminder of where they died. I think we need such reminders because people easily forget the past while they're busy living in the present, planning for the future. But remember, as Santayana said, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And there are a lot of lessons still, I think, to be learned from the 1918 flu, which might be helpful in dealing with COVID. And I want to finish just by commenting on the death toll for COVID, which has now gone past 5 million. I really don't envy the historian of this present pandemic. You'll be very pleased to know that I don't intend to be the historian of this pandemic. But different countries have used different systems or methodologies for recording their COVID and COVID-related deaths. Some of you will know that the UK last year admitted that they hadn't been counting likely COVID deaths in retirement homes, and then they had to readjust their figures. And for a long while, I've been very suspicious of the official figures coming out of China and Russia, not to mention smaller totalitarian regimes. But a huge country like India, I think, is also problematic. Their COVID death toll is probably higher than the official published figures. And there are parts of Africa where we just don't know what's been going on. But still, it could have been worse. And so far, touch wood, COVID has not killed at the same rate as the great 1918 pandemic. There we are. I've had my spiel. That was 30 minutes or so. I hope I finished on time for you, Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Geoff. I found that fascinating and also really moving. Even though I've heard, read some of this information before, the starkness, particularly of the Māori death rates, is and the impact on people is just horrendous. So we're going to, for people who have questions, we're going to do them around 2 o'clock. We are running slightly late, but we started late, so we'll just curtail the time for questions. But I want to thank you very much. And I'd now like to introduce Karacaoglu, who was the head of the School of Government. So he came to Victoria University from the New Zealand Treasury, where he was chief economist. And before then, he was the chief executive of the Cooperative Bank of New Zealand for 9 years. He's got a real interest in public policy and particularly looking at improving intergenerational wellbeing and trying to integrate economic, environmental and social policies. So when we were discussing this, we thought we'll have Geoff first because he's talking about the past and the lessons for the future. But Girol is going to be talking about where we could head in the future, the opportunity that we have to create a difference and learn positively from the pandemic. So I would just like to thank you very much, Geoff, and introduce Girol.
Thank you. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Geoff, for a wonderful and most informative presentation. My brief is to talk about turning disaster into an opportunity, using COVID-19 as a platform. For some reason, I have a disaster here, namely that my screen is frozen and I cannot work through my slides. But what I'll do is to maybe talk instead and not worry about distracting you further. If in the meantime, Shafali can load my slides, then I can work through them, but don't worry about it. I have some key messages to give. I'll give them within 15, 20 minutes, and then we can have a wonderful conversation, I hope. The big theme that I have in my conversation is that in terms of the fundamental environmental, social, and economic challenges that New Zealand is facing right now, COVID-19 is a distraction. In other words, all those underlying illnesses and misfortunes were already extremely evident in the data. Nevertheless, COVID-19, albeit a big tragedy, has created a catalyst and as an opportunity for changing our long-term policy trajectory. The tragedy so far is that we seem unwilling to embrace this opportunity, and we seem to lack the imagination and the leadership to grab it and do something with it. In fact, more recently, I note that in fact, people are now hoping and expecting to go back to where we were and simply go back to life as we knew it. To support the claim that all these trends were evident, in my slides, I present, and they'll be available to you all, data, extended data from the OECD. And I also go back to 2019 to a very significant conversation led by the OECD, Angel Gurria, who actually urged people to take more note of the environmental, social, economic, including inequality and related matters that are affecting us, and urged them to lift their head and stop focusing only on economic matters, and also stop simply measuring and start thinking how we can actually do something with what we are seeing. On another slide, I then come back to New Zealand and go to the 2019 budget. And in that budget, which is called the well-being budget, there's a defining table on page 7, table 1, prepared by the Treasury to inform the government of the day to focus on, let me see whether this is working now. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. Okay, forget it. And the trends highlighted in that table were very much a microcosm of what Gurria had presented to the whole world, and New Zealand Treasury was present at that meeting, namely growing mental health issues, especially among the young, suicide rate, homelessness and such like, deteriorating child well-being measured in all kinds of ways in terms of family violence, health outcomes and such like, increasing divide in society between Maori, Pacifica on one hand and the rest of society on the other, relating to income, education, and health outcomes. Disturbing trends in economic performance as well, and also a huge number of environmental issues relating to greenhouse, waterways, soil erosion, and such like. So the evidence that that COVID-19 is a distraction is all there. The other fundamental claim I make in terms of, in fact, it's an accusation, is to say we are all suffering collectively from a boiling frog syndrome. As you know, a boiling frog comfortably sits in a gently warming water, not aware that if he or she keeps sitting there, it will boil. When COVID-19 hit us, we realized that there was actually a boiling water. It was existential. It affected all of us, including the wealthy, the young, and everyone else. And therefore, and we were told a very convincing narrative by the government, supported by Parliament at large, and we reacted to it immediately. Whereas the environmental, social, economic, and other ills that we are facing are slow burning issues, and a good proportion of the population especially the well-to-do, think that they can pay themselves out of this disaster and ignoring it. COVID-19 actually exacerbated all these trends that we're seeing. I was very lucky, the OECD literally 2 weeks ago published a document called Beyond COVID-19. It's about a 400-page document, which I've read, at least skimmed through in detail, and it highlights a series of concerns showing that all those trends we were already aware of are being exacerbated. They refer to some of the current well-being concerns, highlighting physical and mental health, highlighting job security and related financial security issues, housing, and various other domestic violence and so on. By the way, several people in New Zealand have been doing studies to paint a similar picture. One of them is Dr. Kate Prickett, who is a colleague, but many others are doing the same. So what I'm painting here is really a global image of exactly what we're going through. So deteriorating well-being, especially among the most vulnerable people, becoming more exacerbated, children and young people, disadvantaged racial and ethnic communities, low-paid, low-income people, disadvantaged women in particular, and some elderly populations. And then it goes on to say, actually, it's much worse than that, because these deteriorations are also compromising the future well-being of generations, and it's eroding our social capital, it's eroding our natural capital, and it's eroding our economic capital. And to read one or two main points, it says the impacts of COVID-19 on quality of life have not been distributed evenly across the populations of OECD countries. While men and the elderly were more likely to die from the virus, women and young people have been more likely to suffer a deterioration in mental health and life satisfaction. It says people on lower incomes or without employment and or members of racial and ethnic minority groups are more likely to experience worse physical and mental health outcomes. It talks about children from disadvantaged households being particularly at risk. And it talks about inequalities to access to green space and others. And these are not simply words representing 44 countries. It provides a huge amount of evidence to support it with data, graphs, and various other pictures and such like. So why does COVID-19, in the context of this background and deteriorating and concerning trends, provide an opportunity that the OECD too, like me, are urging anyone who is listening to grab and do something with? Everyone is talking about COVID-19 presenting an opportunity. To the best of my knowledge, it's all talk. First of all, it's an opportunity because it shocked us. Although many people have been warning us about the possibility of such an epidemic, it shocked us. It was existential for all of us. All of a sudden, we started talking about team of 5 million. The people we tend to pay very lowly became critical workers. We realized that without them, we cannot live or survive. All of a sudden, we realized that something that the markets is not treating well is something that we need to grab. These people are precious, and we need to make sure that they live valued lives. It also convinced the people like the Business New Zealand and all that, which is very interesting, that they turn to government, that government is an integral part of the social fabric and economic fabric of society. It requires a genuine partnership between government, the communities, business, scientists, academics, and so on. And most interestingly, and to me, most rewardingly, it forced us to have different and creative type of conversations that we were not having. And I always refer to what's happening in a very small part of New Zealand, namely Queenstown. For 15, 20 years in Queenstown, society at large were begging to the council and all that to take note of the deteriorating social fabric of Queenstown and the deteriorating environment of Queenstown based on the pressures created by increasing tourism numbers. But business people kept wanting, and they were successful in putting more and more money into infrastructure that supported tourism. But when COVID-19 hit and the tourism pipeline started to dry up, all of a sudden those very same business people were at the table, I'm told, talking about reimagining Queenstown in a world where there is no tourism, to take an extreme case, or very little tourism, to take a more reasonable case. And they started talking about a place where talent wants to live, just like Sir Paul Callaghan asked us to imagine New Zealand as a place talent wants to live, a place where ideas are incubated and commercialized and sold to the rest of the world, and on it goes. Unfortunately, I was there only 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately, they've forgotten about imagining, and now they are all simply imagining a return of tourism so that they can keep living the lives as they used to live. So that's a very disturbing reality of the boiling frog syndrome. So what is required to be done in order to move forward? First of all, we have to ask the right question. And the right question, to my mind, is the following. If the core objective of good governance, and I put a lot of emphasis on governance, is to safeguard the well-being of current and future generations, how can governance systems be better attuned to reach these goals? And then I say the next thing that we need to be aware of is to use the right framework. And the right framework has several dimensions, which I articulate in the slides and in other stuff that I've done. The first point, and all this is totally aligned and independently, I was joyed to read by the OECD work. First of all, we need to take a systemic approach to it. In other words, multidimensional, thinking of environment, society, culture, politics, and economics as integrated, and thinking of investments that are complementary and mutually reinforcing. The second and fundamental point is we need to focus on resilience building as a core proposition of investing for the future. And that requires us to take a different mentality to public policy than we've been following and the world has been following. Namely, instead of acting like social planners, trying to guess what will happen in the future and trying to shape our lives to fit it, we need to accept that the future is radically uncertain. And all we can do is to create what I call a well-being garden, which is surrounded by posts that refer to environmental quality, social cohesion, economic prosperity, and civil and political rights, accessible to everyone, and take the mentality that our role as policymakers is not to anticipate what future generations will want or how they want to live, but to prepare a broader garden and ecosystems that will allow people to live the lives they value. And unless we look after the environment, natural environment, the social fabric, social cohesion, remember there are over 200 ethnicities living in this beautiful country, and of course look after our economic potential and protect our political and other rights. And remember, not given, look at America, Hungary, and other places around the world. These things, as Professor John Gould taught me in 1978, New Zealand follows the rest of the world in social, environmental, and economic trends with a 10 to 15-year lag. Yes, kiss the ground of New Zealand, but don't be deluded that we are protected. We are embedded in everything that's happening around the world. Why do I focus on resilience? Because I frame it as follows. I say, if we face a radically uncertain future, including uncertainty about how people want to live their lives, and we respect the rights of people to live however they choose to live, provided they allow others to do the same, then there is no predetermined path that we can optimize using economic tools. All we have is a multiplicity of possible evolutions, and the role of public policy is to make sure that as we evolve, we do not fall off the cliff. And the cliff is defined by the perimeters of the well-being garden. A cliff defined by social cohesion, good environment, and economic platform, and political rights, and equity and fairness. So the distinctive role of public policy is to ensure that we are making sure that that garden is being looked after. And as we drive our car and our lives through that garden, we don't fall off the cliff by widening the garden through appropriate investments. So how do we do that? Well, the OECD, total alignment with how I was thinking, says there are 5 institutional building blocks for such a governance structure. The first of all is we need to be looking at multidimensional well-being and monitoring it. We need to move away from simply monitoring economic performance, but monitoring various well-being indicators. Second, we need to have evidence-informed priorities that are asking the question, what should we invest in order to make sure that all these well-beings are served? By way of example, if we have a lot of poverty, it negatively influences the natural environment. It has negative consequences for social cohesion. It has horrendous consequences for economic performance. So if you hit poverty and you try to address it appropriately, then you can actually enlarge the well-being garden across all dimensions. That's one example. That's the way to think about systemic interdependencies. And in our modeling and policy work, saying, what kind of investments can I make that will actually be complementary so that social, economic, political, environmental issues are all being increased. The third element is long-term focus. Our institutions currently are obsessed with the immediate run. Intergenerational focus. Fourth, integration and collaboration, working both across the public sector in an integrated way, but also across the community, with business, with scientists, with academics, and not consulting with them, but making sure they are in the tent and actively connecting to all these forces. Those are the ingredients. What I did is to apply that to New Zealand and develop a set of steps towards making that happen. I'll go through that quickly and then I'll shut up. The first one is to say that we need to unanimously, we need an institution, somebody who has the leadership, and in our democracy, it has to be the parliament, on behalf of current and future generations, to say intergenerational well-being is the core objective of public policy. Secondly, we need to give effect to that commitment, a cross-parliamentary governance group that is watching and governing intergenerational well-being. Third, we need a compelling story. As Yahari in his beautiful book, Sapiens, says, unless you have a shared narrative, unless you have a safe story, and our Maori people are brilliant in telling stories, let them develop it. Unless we have a coherent story, we will not get to the right place. In the 1950s, 60s, New Zealand had a coherent story. When I read the books, I came here in 1978, it was around fairness. It was about everybody being part of society. It was about sharing everything. And the story goes, we were not very rich, but we were happy and content, and there was no division. And we didn't worry in those days about the environment. We do not have at present a coherent story. We have to have one so that people get carried away and they don't say, well, it doesn't worry me because I have $1 billion. Every government needs to be held accountable to making sure that their policies are aligned with that narrative and long-term focus. The PGG, in other words, Parliamentary Governance Group, is advised by an independent Office of Wellbeing on whether the government programs is aligned with it, and their reports are made public. Everybody sees them. An infrastructure commission, we have one, it is too narrowly focused. They need to redefine infrastructure as environmental, social, economic, political infrastructure. An infrastructure commission acts as the governance group that makes sure that all long-term investment projects that require public funding is aligned with expanding the well-being garden. And when that infrastructure commission is assessing whether to approve or not any infrastructure projects, they don't only care about whether they expand the garden, but ask the question, has it been an inclusive engagement of all communities and everyone? Is it funded by private and public sector jointly? And does it have, as the Ministry of Works in many years ago used to have, a coherent implementation plan? One of the big gaps we have now is that we have no infrastructure that allows communities to have a genuine voice on how we shape our public policies. People, when they listen to me talking like this, say, you are hallucinating. And others say, because I come from Turkey, you are on Turkish drugs again. And the best way to respond to such, they all say it lovingly, by the way, in the typical Kiwi way. Now I know how Kiwis behave. I've been here for 50 years. And I say to them, okay, one thing New Zealanders really like to hear is that other countries are actually doing it and doing it well. And in the OECD report and in my slides, I refer to about 20 countries that are actually doing bits and pieces what I'm talking about. So I'm not hallucinating. So if I were a dictator today, which I don't want to be because I'm obsessed with inclusive processes, what are the primary pressures on our well-being garden, which I provide some evidence for, and how can we address them? When I look at the well-being garden using data over 20 years, I find the main pressures are on our natural environment and our fairness and equity dimensions. And again, fully aligned with the OECD, I was very surprised when I looked at what they believe are their top priorities, and I matched them against what I was thinking of. They are identical. The first thing is we have to deal with poverty. And the way to think of poverty is poverty of well-being, poverty of exclusion from those basic services that I'm talking about. And there is a way, if we have the will, it's called universal basic services, and it can be means tested, so we can fund it. The other one, complementary, since we are talking about intergenerational well-being, how come we have a New Zealand superannuation fund and we do not have a New Zealand children's fund, where we tax people, their wealth and their land in particular, and economists will all agree that that's effective, efficient, and equitable, and put it into a fund that will be available to children when they reach 18 years and so on, if they need it, means tested. Second, to complement that, we need to make sure that we have the policies that shift production and consumption towards cleaner technology and concurrently invest in skilling that is able to work with that technology. So we're all rising together. And third, this is not going to help please everyone, but as Sir Partha Dasgupta said, one of the most important pressures on the both social and natural environment is humongous population growth. And we need to find, not by enforcement, but through education. And the good news is when people are educated and their poverty level is eradicated and they become more comfortable, they themselves choose not to have as many children that they are having. There too, poverty eradication helps. And finally, and now I'll really shut up, all of these things have to be developed together, and process is as important as outcomes. I thank you for your patience and apologies for the technology break. Actually, this speech is much better without slides. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Girol and Geoff, for a really fascinating talk. So we have some time for questions, and I don't think you're hallucinating, Girol. I think it sounds like a wonderful ideal for the future of inclusiveness. So, so Shefali, how does this work? Can people unmute themselves, or do they need to put it in the chat?
No, they can just, I suppose, unmute themselves, or at the most put up their hand, I suppose, and then there's nobody talking over each other.
Right. So now we've got about 20 minutes for questions.
They can raise their electronic hands. They can go to reactions and raise their electronic hands. Maybe that's one way of managing it.
So I did have a question. So in terms of your vision of inclusiveness, have you had a kind of governmental view on this? Have you had a sort of reaction from politicians?
When I talk like that, I talk to some parliamentarians, I talk to the Infrastructure Commission, I talk to my colleagues, I give presentations around the world. And when you don't want to engage with something and you're intellectually lazy, what you say, and I've got this in my life, throughout my life, is you are ahead of us. In other words, go away for 10 years, let us keep drinking our latte, cafe, wine, and whatever, and enjoy life, and we'll worry about it at some stage. So nobody, or they say you're flying at 33,000 feet. In other words, you're too high, get into the detail. What I say deliberately is that public policy has a series of complementary levels. But if you don't get your governance right and your institutions right, all these people who are running around doing beautiful work without any impact. For example, we have a bunch of brilliant young people spread all around the public sector who are doing analysis, dealing with numbers, running regressions. I totally respect that. I use their outputs and outcomes in all my work. But who is looking after the total picture and forest to guide, to make sure that it has impact? We do not have the institutions that pull it together. And the fundamental proposition here is to invest in such institutions in terms of the blocks that I outlined before. So no, I don't get a lot of support in terms of actually following it, to cut it to the chase. Geoff, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Girol. It was a great talk and fits very well with my own feelings. May we take it from this that you're not a great fan for Rogernomics.
I want to say one thing about that so that I'm not misunderstood. And that is critical. That's why I talk about transitions and process as an integral part of public policy. In fact, yesterday, we had a marvelous conversation in memory of Jas McKenzie, who was a public servant in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And therefore, what I'm saying, unfortunately, is not new. He said it about 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Yeah. And the point is that Roger Douglas and such like identified a massive problem. We need to address it, but they did not address the transition from there to the new world. And they didn't carry the people. And the transition was a disaster in terms of the social outcomes. So the intent and the problem definition was okay, but we, as my father-in-law used to say, your old operation is perfect, but the patient has died. And that's the point I'm making. Sorry, Geoff, keep going.
No, well, your last point is splendid, because my work in medical history, I've come across that quite a few times. The best quip about that goes right back to the early 19th century. A French surgeon who adopted a new technique And when questioned by somebody in London, he said, "How many times have you done this operation?" "Oh, about 150 times. And how many have died?" Oh, well, about 149. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, what struck me most forcibly about your speech, Gerald, was its applicability as well to public health. I don't know if you've read David Skegg's book, The Health of the People. This little one from 2019.
Yes, I did. Yes,
But
yes.
that's
It's a
a
beautiful
fine little
book.
manifesto for what has gone wrong with the health system in New Zealand. And I think we're extraordinarily lucky that we managed to deal with COVID as well as we have in the absence of a really strong central public health authority. David was arguing then very strenuously that we need something to pull together all of the assets of the different bits and pieces of government. I mean, the influenza pandemic plan did that to some extent by making the response a quote whole of government response, so that every ministry and department had to have its pandemic plan and its assigned individuals. But public health in general is a much bigger thing than just preparing for pandemics. There are all sorts of other potential threats out there. And there was an article in the paper just this morning quoting Dame Sarah Gilbert. She's the professor who helped to develop the AstraZeneca vaccine, and she makes the point, that Western countries, the US especially, spend billions and billions of dollars on destructive weapons for purposes of defense. And just think how it would be if all of that money was spent on developing ways of reducing poverty, ways of improving health, and ways of improving our response to future pandemics. I entirely agree with that. Thank you, Gerald. A very good paper.
Rosemary.
So are there any additional ideas? Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Geoff and Girol, for very interesting presentations. I really found a lot of this challenging, but also learned a lot about the history of the 1918 pandemic. I've got a question for both of you. First of all, about measuring the true mortality rate. And I'm an avid reader of The Economist, which has a magazine that has developed its own model of measuring the effects of COVID, and arguing that the numbers that we read in the paper on a daily basis are complete underestimates, because what you have to do is you have to look at excess mortality rates, which is basically looking at what's been happening in recent years. And all of a sudden, we know that mortality by cause is difficult to measure. There's lots of comorbidities, lots of problems with the data, but total number of deaths, probably the statistics are reliable enough to look at the peak over the last 2 years compared with the previous years. And of course, you have to adjust for trends. So that's my first question to Geoff is, if you take the Economist view, there is actually, and of course, this is tragic, sadly, we actually may have already had 16 million deaths from COVID. And my question, by the way, Jacques Bout, I'm at the University of Waikato, sorry, I should have started with introducing myself. And my question to Girol is, it sounds like you have some countries in mind that you think are role models, some to inspire over from which we can learn. So I'm immediately intrigued, which are the countries you think that we can learn the best lessons from?
Let Geoff talk about mortality, and then I'll talk about more positive things.
Okay. Well, hello, Jacques. Obviously, we both read The Economist. I didn't want to get into the figures at the end there because they are highly debatable. But yes, the figure of 16 million excess deaths is not by any means out of the ballpark. So the methodologies are so diverse and so different. I think I've come to the view that excess deaths is probably the most accurate way to measure the total impact of the of the pandemic. And similarly, back in 1918, most of the official figures published around the world were very conservative, the lowest possible. And one of my problems when I started my own work was, did I limit my counting simply to those that had influenza and or pneumonia? And I decided early on, no, the social impact was much greater than that, because there were people like women who were pregnant or in childbirth who died, who would not have died if they hadn't also had the flu. Right. So I felt that they had to be included. So that's partly why my figures are a good deal higher than the official figures from 1919. But anyway, that's all I want to say. I agree with you entirely.
Thank you.
In terms of the question directed to me, there's a lot of detail in two documents which are extremely recent, both of which I referred to in my presentation, and the slides will guide you to one of them is the Putting Wellbeing Metrics into Public Policy Action by OECD conference. If you go there, you'll find about 20 presentations from countries ranging Scotland, the Netherlands, Wales, the UK, France, and many others. And then in the 2021, just 2 weeks ago, beyond COVID-19 OECD document, there's again lots of data produced from many, many countries that are doing similar things. In terms of being specific, for example, Wales has its Future Generations Commissioner. And when the equivalent of their infrastructure commission puts forward a project, as they did with their M4 highway project, which was intended to improve transport in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, time saving, and all that, which is one of the well-being corners, which is material prosperity and comfort. The commissioner pushed back and said, absolutely, we need to improve people's convenience in terms of transport. And your project will absolutely do that. But your project will cause a lot of harm to the natural environment. So we beg you to go back and look at other options that will still deliver close to the kind of material outcome, transport, but also cause less harm to the environment. And that's a real world example of how it worked. The other countries that I list are Scotland, Finland has a parliamentary commission for the future, Singapore is doing the same thing, and on it goes. And then in the 2021 document, there's a beautiful table that maps out from starting in 2011, all the countries that are doing bits and pieces of the kind of framework that I'm talking about. So we have a lot to learn from them, but none of them have been able to pull it together into a totally coherent whole. They are working on the edges of this stuff.
Thanks, Girol. So the slides will become available on the PEN's website. Is that the plan?
Yes, I hope so. Rosemary has decision rights on that.
Thank you.
Yes, as long as you're both happy, we'll put up the slides. That would be great. I think I did try sharing them, but you were doing so well without them, decided to leave them. So we have another question.
Wing has a question, raised his electronic hand.
Rosemary, can you enable chat so that people can actually write the messages? I do have a comment and several questions. I think it's really good to actually look at Singapore as an example, potentially, because the latest global burden of disease has been released in the Lancet, actually demonstrated Singapore has the highest healthy life expectancy as well as total life expectancy. And the gain in the last 10 years has been gaining on us and actually be widening. They're leading away, so to speak, in terms of both healthy life expectancy and life expectancy compared to New Zealand for the last 10 years. So there are lots of public policies that we probably want to consider, and a number of health areas in particular. I do actually emphasize, I do agree around the universal coverage of core services. And we do actually have a lot of, in New Zealand, we do have a lot of fundamental elements that we can do very well. Like, for example, we've got a PHO enrollment close to 95%. We can actually build on that and work between sectors, as the speakers has been actually highlighting. I would caution though, rather than actually creating another administrative layer of having an institution, we should actually much more collaboratively work more collaboratively across different sectors, without actually creating the administrative burden going forward. I can also make a little comment around the fertility rate. I think the teenage pregnancy in New Zealand has actually have been quite flat and actually fallen quite a lot. That's probably related to the reversible long-term implantable contraceptions. So there are a number of things that we probably could consider and discuss, but that's probably beyond the scope of this question, really.
I can make one or two comments, which are all beautiful. Thank you very much. First of all, Singapore is a beautiful example on many counts. When I talk about Singapore and New Zealand, they say, oh, well, they have an authoritarian regime and all that kind of thing, although Singaporeans may not agree with that. In any case, the point that is to be made is that you cannot have organ transplant from one body to the other without looking at where it's coming from, where it's going. Of course, you need to take into account the culture, the history, the whatever that you're going to embed that institution in. So you can look at what Singapore is doing and then say, well, can we fit it into our circumstances? Singapore is also very interesting. It shows us that what we consider to be a basic social service that we need to provide to people is not God-given. It is decided by society. In New Zealand, we allow health and education services to all citizens, but then when it comes to housing, we don't do that. In Singapore, to the best of my knowledge, 70% of housing stock is owned by the government. They've decided that, in fact, housing, just like education and health, will also be a basic human right that the government has to provide either directly or through subsidies or whatever else. So these are all decisions we have to make as a society. But unless we have a coherent narrative telling people that unless we do that, it will come home to bite because we are all in this pool that's boiling together, it is not going to work. That's precisely why the narrative is so important. We don't have one right now, most unfortunately.
I was just going to say that the Human Rights Commission has launched guidelines to a decent home, and they're starting a 2-year inquiry on that it's a human right to have a right to a decent home. So currently, myself and a colleague are helping out with the Human Rights Commission on this and are identifying indicators to kind of raise that and raise the consciousness of that within society. So I think it was really great that you mentioned housing, because it really is fundamental to people's health and well-being, and particularly the health of children and the vulnerable.
One other point Wing made, which you very quickly referred to, I totally hope and agree that instead of creating more monsters in terms of institutional structures, it was always better in corporate life, whether it's public or private, to make the current institutions work better. And of course, working cross-government, working collaboratively are the mottos in the Public Service Act 2020 as well. And this has been talked about for about 20 years. The reality is it's not happening. And if you go to recent history, when the Social Investment Agency was established, initially Bill English's view was, instead of creating another institution, we should actually get all these agencies to work collaboratively. In fact, they came to the top level of the Treasury and they were working on that project. Then in desperation, because it wasn't working, those people had dual reporting lines and they weren't sufficiently focused on the purpose of the social well-being. Now it is well-being. It used to be Social Investment Agency. In frustration, he created the Social Investment Agency, which for political reasons was renamed Social Well-being Agency. So I totally support what you're saying, if we can make it work. Organizationally, it's a huge challenge. Rav, you have something to say, please.
And that will have to be the last question because we're almost at 2:30. Thank you.
Okay, very quick. Thanks, Girol. You're not hallucinating. You're seeing the world very clearly. So carry on. 2 quick questions for you. One on housing. How do we decommodify housing? That's one question. And 2, in terms of well-being, one of the challenges certainly I experienced as a local government representative is that local and central government operate under 2 operating systems. Basically, they have different software, yet they're both focused or supposed to focus on well-being. Do you have any thoughts on how we could potentially reform local government or central government in a way that they actually match up their software systems so that they can actually work, more collaboratively and not replicate or compete with each other in different areas?
Very quickly, both questions. The answers are very obvious if we have the will to do it. On the first one, housing. Of course, housing is now a portfolio, an asset in our investment portfolio, and it is a very attractive asset because of the horrendous, distorted, unbelievably inequitable taxing system we have. If you fix the taxing system, either put capital gains or wealth, or not wealth, land, especially unused land tax and such like, all of a sudden, not only will you affect the equity, intergenerational equity, but also pricing and also reduce the attractiveness of that. So most unfortunately, the current government, having talked about capital gains, and then it comes to power and they have the absolute majority, and then they say, sorry, we cannot do it. That's the greatest disappointment of the last 5 years in my professional life. In terms of the how do you pull the local, regional, and central together in terms of well-being? As you know, there is the 4 well-beings approach in the regions. The government is talking about the well-being budget and so on. The Local Government Act Review provides a fantastic opportunity to somehow institutionalize, making sure that the debate is not whether local, regional, central government is good, bad, or ugly, but peel off the onion totally and say, given what we are trying to do in terms of intergenerational well-being, what are the distinctive advantages of these institutions? How can we work together so that the outcome will be not that one will do or the other one? It is the end, as corporate jargon goes. And for example, in social cohesion, local government has a humongous advantage. But in controlling inflation, of course, you have to do it from the center, and on it goes. And if the Infrastructure Commission was really running an inclusive process, then they would actually, under the Institution for or Generational Wellbeing, would have actually a well-being measure that covers the whole country. And it's talking about regional as well as, in fact, one of my students, Mubashir Muhtar, did brilliant work on measuring well-being at the local, regional level. And his PhD work, hopefully, if he does it, will be on then converting into public policy and see how we can integrate that regional work with the national work. Because you're right, it's broken now. They are dealing with different parts of it, and everybody is digging holes and measuring everything that comes their way. But nobody knows what to do with their measurement. Because intellectually, it's so easy to create more data and measure and run regressions. It's very attractive.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have to close it now because I think the Zoom meeting stops abruptly at 2:30. So I would just like to thank both our speakers. And in a minute, I'll get you to do the clap function on the reactions if you want to do that. But I'd also just like to give a shout out for our population conference, which we've rescheduled to April next year. And this is a kind of taster in advance of the Population Association conference. So if you're interested, you can have a look at the details on our website. But meantime, that was really fascinating, and I'd be very happy to share the slides. So we'll aim to put those up on our website so that people can have a look at them. But if everyone could join me in thanking Girol and Geoffrey.
Thank you all, and thank you, Geoff. I found your presentation absolutely beautiful, very informative, learned a lot. Thank you very much. Extremely appreciated. Thank you. Bye-bye.
The same for you. Bye.